Yeah, good morning, everybody. Really happy to be here. Thanks, Ellen and Mabel, for inviting me. And as Ellen said, I'm a special education instructor here at the University of Portland. I'm going to talk about some classroom educational applications for the neurosemantic language learning theory, but also the neuroeducation framework that we've been studying today, and how I've used that in a special education classroom. I'm going to start with a similar story to what Bonnie did, in that I've been working in education for about 10 years. Half of that time was teaching English as a second language, and then I moved into special education. And part of my job, a large part of my job, was to work with students that had been kicked out of mainstream educational settings and to try to figure out strategies for including them back into these gen ed classes. A lot of the students that came to me had been out of traditional schools for anywhere from 5 to 10 years, depending on how old they were. And so a lot of them had social emotional disorders or violent behavior or some kind of problem with the law that facilitated them being kicked out of mainstream schools and into kind of an alternative setting, which is where I was. I was housed in a comprehensive high school, so I did have the opportunity to push students out into these classes when they were ready, but they expressed so much anxiety and frustration about being in these settings that I really knew I needed to figure out other strategies to help them, because I couldn't give them all the credits they needed to graduate. They couldn't just take my class and then get a diploma. So we needed to figure out a way to get them over that finish line. So a lot of these students, they spend the majority of their day in these resource rooms and the special education classes. And the continuum really should be, the goal should be, we're moving them along this continuum to what we call the least restrictive environment. For those of you that study special education, that's what our goal is. And really, this is the law. I mean, the law is that we really should be moving these students along the continuum, because the law says that special classes, such as the one that I was in, should really only be used as a last case scenario, basically, unless, so for example, if the nature of severity is such that education, regular classes, is not successful, even though we're giving accommodations and modifications. So sort of like, we have to try general education first, and if that doesn't work, they come back to me, and then I give them different strategies to be successful, and we try again. So cognitive neuroscience is another one of our lenses that we've been talking about today. And when you study neuroscience, it actually informs these same practices as well. It really supports the principle that the only way to build these pro-social concepts in the brain is exposure to pro-social situations. Because what happens in the brain is, we've already alluded to it today. Dr. Arvid talked about how language changes the brain, and then Bonnie talked about how learning is a permanent change in the brain. But another way of looking at that is the interplay between what we call brain structure and brain function. So we've got a little animated diagram here of some neurons firing and connecting, which is pretty cool. But the actual function of the brain is, how do we, and really I would like this graphic to go back and forth so that information is not only coming into the brain, but then it's also going back out. We have this complex interplay between structure and function that essentially you have to keep going back and forth, so that as you use more language to build your language function, you see that reflected in the brain structures, and then vice versa, okay? It's this never-ending back and forth that we see. So in other words, the only way for the brain to physically make these pro-social connections is through the language that the students are using. And the pro-social concepts have to be acquired over time using this language. We call this complex interplay, we call that synergy, and kind of back and forth learning there. So psychology, neuroscience, all of those things are really giving me the theory, the foundation for some of the methods that I'm going to show you in just a little bit. Some of the main takeaways from this presentation, kind of summarized in a nutshell, would be that all behavior is a form of communication. But really what that says is that the way that a child behaves informs me how they learn, okay? And as Bonnie has said lots of times, students that know how to learn rarely misbehave in school, okay? They don't need to misbehave. They're too busy learning. Learning is a neurological, biological high, and we see that reflected in students' behavior. So when a student comes to me with antisocial behavior, what I know is that I need to assign meaning to help them learn and acquire these prosocial concepts that's going to allow them to fit in with the neurotypical peers, and it's going to be able to give them access to the type of quality education that all students in the United States really deserve, regardless of disability. Everybody deserves to be educated in a pro-social community. We're going to look at how the clinical observation shows us how these students acquire concepts. And then we're also going to take a look at these questions in a moment. So how does language function for the students, and how can we develop our brain-based strategies to include these students? Well, if our goal, and I hope it is our goal, is to try to maximize the social inclusion of the students in the United States, we really have a paradigm shift that needs to happen in how we interpret, in how we classify, and how we understand students with these social emotional disabilities. So we want to review how do we interpret disturbed behavior, and how can we make this shift from the teaching to a strengths-based model of learning. We're going to use some of these principles here. We're going to learn some of this brain-based theory that we've been talking about today, and how the educational change really has to become systemic across the United States. So these are things that you probably already know from taking these workshops and reading books, is that 90% or more of individuals, they're learning with the visual system, visual symbolizing system. Okay? Auditory feedback by itself is not going to form lasting concepts in the brain for a lot of these students, a lot of our strugglers. So part of our job is we have to make visual, make our auditory instruction that we tend to do, make it visual. The way that we do this is we really have to have a lot of those overlap of those visual layers. Best way to do that is just start drawing and writing. So I'm going to jump in and talk about and show some examples of how I just started drawing and writing with my students and really started to see a lot of great changes there. Well, I borrowed this from Mabel, and this is the chart that shows the developmental stages of behavior. And one of the first things that I ask a student to do if they are showing behavior that is at a developmental level that is lower than their age would suggest they would be, is I would just ask them, where are you on the chart? Where is your behavior? Okay. We want them to identify that and go over this, have this become part of your daily exercise here. Another way to look at that would be just a different kind of graph. I had students that were functioning anywhere along this continuum. It depends on the day, kind of depends on how stressed they were in their system. So I had students, for example, with autism that had a lot of concepts and a lot of patterns, but if the teacher gave them a pattern that didn't necessarily match with what they were expecting, they could drop all the way from a concrete down to a sensory motor where they were rolling on the floor, and they completely lost their pictures from their head. So it's a very fluid dynamic that happens here. So what I started doing was I started cartooning and started to make visual some of the choices that the students were making. And a lot of times students didn't necessarily know that they were making choices or that they even had choices to their behavior. So I'm going to zoom in on this cartoon in just a moment. But what this shows is this was a student that kept punching the bus driver and punching other paraeducators that were trying to help her. I mean, that's what we do as educators, right? We try to help people. And she was, clocking them. So I drew this out, and I'm going to walk through these here. And they're not perfect, but this is just where I was at a starting point. So this is my student here, and this is me, and I'm giving some instruction. And in my head, I'm thinking, I'm seeing that my student is very upset, but I don't really necessarily know why at this point. So I'm explaining to the student, if you feel yourself starting to get angry, and you decide to punch, kick, or hit another student or staff, because at this point, her thoughts are spiraling and she's now at the point where she's reaching out. Arm is moving through space and making contact with, hopefully not my head, but maybe somewhere else. And what happens from that point is that the vice principal, the student has to get called into the vice principal's office. The vice principal has to follow the school rules, very clearly in the handbook, and the student must be suspended or expelled. Vice principal really has no choice. That's what happens. And so this is the vice principal says the rules say you must be suspended or expelled. The irony of all of this is that this student loved school. She wanted to be in school, and she would get really bummed and upset about having to leave and be expelled or suspended. So we want to provide choices for students if we want to empower them. And what I wanted to show to her is that you have a choice. If your thoughts are starting to spiral here, you can use your words to ask for space. And the way that I'm going to reply is, well, thanks for asking. That's very kind of you. About 10 minutes later, we have a little cool down period, and staff will know how they can help you and how you're able to stay in school when you use your words, such as, I got really angry because I couldn't do this math assignment. And my response is going to be very helpful. That's okay. How can I learn? Or how can I help? That kind of thing. Also, the bottom part of that was this student was almost arrested at one point, and she was very confused about why the police officer showed up at school. She didn't really understand. And I started to tell her, when you turn 18 and someone says something mean or hurtful to you, and you decide to hit them or strike them instead of walking away, you will be arrested and you may have to go to jail. Okay, and she was very surprised to learn that there's consequences to your actions, especially once you turn 18, that get locked up. Okay. So that was one-on-one cartooning. I also had students that were coming to my class late. They were getting lost wandering around the school. Their gen ed teachers were saying, well, yeah, they're pretty nice students, but they're always late, and they don't seem to have their books, and they're not prepared for class. So I would just draw out a visual schedule of what they needed to do at the beginning of the day. This is just, I think, a quarter of the whole visual schedule that we drew out. And we've got the students arriving at the bus and getting some breakfast from staff, and it depends on the day, but a lot of days they had to just go right from the bus to their class. And that was confusing for them because my class kind of served as a home base where we would check in the morning, but not necessarily every morning. So they would show up at my door, and I'd say, well, no, this is a period 2 day. You're supposed to go down the hall. So we have to draw all that out. We have to draw them that they're thinking about what class they have, what time the bell rings, that they need to be in their seat, before the bell rings, not when it's ringing or after it's ringing, that kind of thing. And we had very, very quick passing periods in my class. So they would actually have to run down the hall. And so I would draw them running, and they'd be like, oh, okay, we have to run. Because I had a really, really big school, and it took a long time to get from one side to the other. Okay. Also drew out some examples of group. We had social emotional group twice a week. And I don't know if you've tried to sit down 10 students that are kind of at a pre-operational low concrete level, put them in a group and you say, go. What's going to happen? Well, if I'm pre-operational, I want to share what I want to share, right? And if you're pre-operational, you want to share what you want to share. So we're going to have a lot of talking over each other, right? We're going to have a lot of, what did you do over the weekend? And then 9 people just all of a sudden start telling their story. So we have to draw out what it looks like to be part of a pro-social group. We have our counselor start out, and we ask students how they're feeling and if they'd like to share any thoughts. And the counselor here is thinking about the different people in the group, and so she asks, how are you doing? And people have different answers to that, which is great. Everybody has their own answer. And when someone else raises their hand to speak, well, it's really polite to look at them or in their general direction, to listen what they have to say and try to make pictures in your head of their story. So this person's telling a story about they're feeling stressed out because they lost their backpack, et cetera. And we've got people making eye contact and thinking about the story that that person's saying in their head. And this is a group is a time when we practice listening to others and thinking about the pictures in their head. It's practice. We have to scaffold this and practice this over time. Everyone can share their story, and it's respectful to listen and empathize with their experiences. Okay? Notice that I didn't necessarily just say, please use respect, right? What does respect look like in group? That's different. It looks different than it does when we're doing our study skills, or we're going over our planner check, or we're doing language arts, that kind of thing. Respect looks different in these different environments. I had students that would, I don't know about you, but I had students that would freak out with assemblies. Assemblies are one of those things where we tell everybody to enter. I was in a high school, so there was 1,000-something students all yelling and screaming. That's what they want you to do. They want you to start yelling and screaming and make a lot of noise, that kind of thing. And I had students that just absolutely could not handle it, to the point where they would lock them. They would lock themselves in the bathroom and would put their feet up on the toilet so that if you looked through the bottom of the stall, you didn't know if they were there or not. A little awkward for me because sometimes that was the girls' bathroom and I wasn't really supposed to go in there. So I would just kind of, we'll deal with this next time. But what I wanted to show students is that they have options during an assembly. So we need to be on time. That's the first thing. So we need to give a little bit of time. At 9:25, students get ready to pack up their supplies in their backpack so we can be on time. So we show them packing up their backpack, etc. We walk through the gym door. And it's not really the best representation, but I drew an aerial view of where the students are supposed to sit. Juniors, seniors, freshmen are supposed to sit in different places. So they had an option of sitting in those places or sitting with my classroom. Either one is fine. We kind of had our own little separate area. And I said assemblies can be very loud, so you may bring some headphones and a music player if you need to, or you can bring an object to help you cope, such as a book or calculator, etc. And we've got a student that chose to sit right by the actual speaker, and they're very stressed out, and this person's really stressed out because there's loud music up there. So just telling them they have different options that they can do for this. And once we drew this out, we really saw a reduction in anxiety because they figured, oh, okay, I don't have to just sit there and suffer. What are my options? Another example would be for study skills. Study skills is one of those things when you talk to special education teachers, they really struggle with it because they say, well, I just don't know why don't they write in their planners? Why don't they have their organized binder? Why don't they, what is going on? So we had to draw that out. We had study skills in the morning, so 9 o'clock when that starts, students are in their seats with their binders open, planners out, thinking about how they will finish any remaining homework at home, or any remaining homework from home and at school. Okay, so they're thinking about their homework plan. And I'm going to check in with anyone to let them know about any scheduling issues, any weird schedules, and they might think about what they're going to do over break and the free breakfast that's offered. And then students will quietly write out and draw a plan of how they will finish any remaining homework in class. And if they still need to do it at home, that's fine. They're thinking about the different classes that they have, and the plan looks good to me. What does an organized binder look like? People, I don't know if you have these students, but for my students, organization was something kind of like this, where we just sort of, this is the backpack, and we just shoved all the papers into there, right? And you would end up with crumpled papers, and oh gosh. So one time it took about 45 minutes to pull out all the papers from a student's backpack and try to uncrinkle them and all that, and lots of fun. So when you receive a handout in class, it's important that you hole punch it, put it in the correct section in your binder so that it does not get lost. Teacher, this is one of the things that gen ed teachers do. They give papers without hole punches, and it's like, what in the world? Why are you giving just a handout and you want people to put it in their binder? when are they supposed to hole punch it? Do you want them to walk up and then hole punch it and disrupt class? I don't really understand that. So, put it in your English section, and you're thinking about, I need to do my English essay. I can find it hole punched in my English section, hopefully. And that way, you can, when you're at home or working at school, you can find the document you need, and parents and teachers will be able to help you, etc. So we had to draw all that out for them. Now, you might be thinking, okay, well, here's what's interesting. Going over a lot of academic stuff here. And that's true. But remember that when students can't do these things, what do we tend to see from them? Exactly, okay? So that student that was shoving all the papers in their backpack, that was his way of basically saying, screw you, I don't need organization. I can find, and that's what he would say, I can find any paper that you want me to find in this backpack. And we challenged him numerous times. Always failed, always failed. He didn't know what organization was. He didn't know how it could benefit him. And so I really just had to try to hopefully have him acquire that idea that, hey, look, this can be really beneficial for you. You don't have to spend 45 minutes rifling through all your papers. And the last component to the drawing and the writing is for pro-social concepts. The best case scenario would be to try to have the students start drawing and writing for themselves. So this is just one slide from a student that would come to me who hadn't really learned how to make visual her anxiety. And so she would come, and it would just be this verbal, just nonstop, just this, oh, this person said this, and I didn't know what they meant by when blah, 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 and it would, a million miles an hour, you're trying to decipher all of it. What we learned to do over a period of time was to draw out these frustrations and these anxieties to the point where I would say, Jamie, okay, stop, put a pin in what you're saying. You need to draw out your frustration right now and then come back to me. Frustration's still going to be there. Don't worry about that. Come back to me with what you are concerned about. And often the concern would change a little bit. It would sort of morph from the point where it was verbal to after she drew it out, that was a little bit extra layer of understanding about what it is, why I was getting stressed. And so this was an example of if someone comes up to her unexpectedly, she jumps and startles with an unexpected touch. And the person says, oops, sorry, I didn't mean to startle you. And in her voice, in her words, she's saying, that's okay. But in her thoughts, she's saying, I want to kill you for touching me. Okay, so kind of sad, but we worked through this. And she learned to draw. She had really great drawing results from that. Okay, I want to jump into why these methods work, kind of picking up on some of what Ellen said and what Bonnie's mentioned. Words are not the unit of analysis for the brain, right? That's a very common misperception that we see out in the field. We think, okay, we need to acquire more vocabulary. If we just acquire more vocabulary about anxiety, the student will know what to say. Not necessarily. The brain's only going to take in sensory information if it's meaningful, right? Well, I don't know about you, but oral lectures and oral instructions, sometimes even for me, those are challenging. So if I put myself in a visual movement learner's shoes, it's going to be really stressful, I think, and it might not necessarily be as meaningful as it could be. So what I've learned is that visual learners are not going to acquire social concepts through just a combination of acoustic and visual patterns. That's what we're doing right now is the oral lectures and a lot of auditory methods. What they do need is that overlap visual to visual, overlap the drawing and the writing. Do that in real time, movement of the hand, watching the movement of the speaker's mouth move, that kind of thing. When we get enough of those access points, that's when we start to see that long-term potentiation. We sometimes call that memory. We sometimes call that just learning language. All right. So these are some examples that a lot of you are probably already doing, and please keep doing it because it's helping. Bubbling ideas, hand-over-hand tracing, finger spelling, all those kinds of things. I still haven't quite figured out, as Mabel can do, is drawing the bubble without the words in the middle, the letters in the middle. I can't do that just yet, but I'm practicing that. All right, so what can we take away from today? We know that all behavior is a form of communication. Students that are showing me antisocial behavior, I know that they cannot learn in that environment. Their behavior is showing me that we need to change up the input, do something a little different. Okay. Visual learners with emotional behavioral disabilities, or really most any visual learners, they can function appropriately in these gen ed classes when they can learn. When we give them the strategies to be successful, you would be very surprised at how successful they can be, even to the point where I had a lot of students that were quote unquote more impacted and quote unquote more, I guess, more restricted, I guess, in their, trying to think of the correct terminology, how would we say? Yeah, exactly, in the severity, yeah, perfect. So on paper, I had students that were more severely impacted, but they were actually functioning more successfully than other special education case manager students in the classes. And when I would go talk to the gen ed teachers, they would say, oh gosh, there's no problem with your students. Yeah, I wish all of the students could be like that. They're ready to go once they come to class. And there's bullying that happens, and they just kind of don't really get engaged with it, and that's great. And then just sort of the takeaway would be that social inclusion of students with disabilities, it's not their problem. We can't expect those students to know how to include themselves. This is our problem, our solution that we need to come up with. It's really our duty as a progressive society to try to figure out this social justice issue. How can we move students along that continuum, least restrictive environment? And I would even say that in some ways it's even more important for general education teachers to have this information, because students start in general education by default. That's the law. You have to start in general education. Somewhere along the line, something happens and there's a breakdown. And I would say, I don't know what percentage, but definitely higher than 50% of those cases probably could have been solved right then and there in the general education class. And we don't need to marginalize and exclude them and pull them out with these kinds of strategies.
More typically developing students support situations that are challenging. Is that even a thing that should be happening? I don't know.
Well, I have one answer, and then if Ellen wants to add anything to that, feel free, please. The way I look at it is that I've been in special education for a while, and my feeling is that it comes from the administrator. It comes from creating the environment of the school. And what I tell my students now that are getting their teaching credentials is I say, you're going to be dual endorsed in general education and special education. People are going to want you. You're going to be sought after. So when you're sitting in the interviews and you're interviewing with the administrator, you need to be the one asking the questions about the school culture. What do you do to foster inclusion in your school? How many students are pulled out for these restricted classes, that kind of thing? Because you're going to get burned out if there's a mismatch between where you're teaching and the philosophy of the school. And we have these laws, we have these rules and guidelines and everything, but the de facto way is that administrators set the tone of the school. And some of them that have these kind of backgrounds for inclusion do fantastic jobs. And you walk in, everybody feels welcome. There's a great sense of community. But there's other administrators that don't have that background, or maybe the way I think about it is like, you can only have so many priorities, right? So if your priority is test scores, that's what the culture of the school is going to look like and feel like. If the priority of the school is inclusion, that's what it's going to look like and feel like. So as far as actual methods, yeah, I don't know if I have like a whole lot I could list off, but that's the way I think about it.
They're unable to do that. And how do you overcome that?
I guess my question would be, Are you drawing only when a behavior comes up, or are you building that into the fabric of your instruction? Because when you build it into the daily part of your routine, it's kind of like, oh, okay, now we're drawing time. And then it becomes less of a sort of stigma of, oh, now it's time to sit down and draw and that kind of thing.
Okay, Chris, thank you so much.
All right, thank you.